Where does technology come from? Are we in control of it, or is it in control of us? Genetic engineering is developing, evolving, accelerating, and creating a future that we all have to live in. Will it be a future where we are healthier and happier, or a dark one that increases the suffering of life on Earth? It has been said that science fiction and science itself are connected. Each feeds the other. Science fiction writers look just beyond the science of today and imagine what is possible. Do their stories then inspire the next generation of scientists? Or is technology an uncontrollable process that is larger than us, like geology, evolution, the orbiting of the planets?
We don't know what we don't know. We can't always control what we create. Things go wrong. It's a problem that keeps me up at night.
I'm Cody Sheehy, your host. I'm also the director of the documentary Make People Better. This film tells the story of how a Chinese scientist secretly created the world's first genetically engineered babies.
And I'm your co-host, Samira Kiani, a medical doctor, genetic engineer, and co-producer of the film. You're listening to the Make People Better podcast, brought to you by the RandomGood Foundation, where we introduce you to the greatest minds and most interesting people at the cusp of a genetic engineering revolution that is transforming science fiction into science fact.
In this final episode, we are going to step inside the mind of Robert Cooper, a writer and producer of the hit sci-fi show Stargate SG1. He has a keen insight into how imagined worlds may inspire science and the development of new technology. He also suffers from a rare genetic disease that may someday be cured by genetic engineering. Who better to help us make sense of where the genomic revolution is taking us, and if it is possible for humanity to grab the reins? But first, a word from our sponsors.
The Make People Better podcast is brought to you by the RandomGood Foundation.
If we are going to shape the future, first, we need to agree on what we would like that future to be. Depending on what culture you're born into, what country you live in, and how your own life experiences have shaped you, the future you might imagine could look pretty different. Joe Zahner wants to be cyberpunk. George Church wants to live forever. Kevin Esfelt wants to control and re-engineer the natural world. For others, these futures might feel pretty dystopian. If history is any guide, different cultures aren't going to agree on what's best.
But there may be some common ground. We can probably all agree that modern medicine is a technological wonder that has vastly improved the human condition. Imagine a Civil War-era field hospital doing amputations with no anesthesia, or when a simple cut could become a life-ending infection. Life before modern medicine was too often brutal and short. And if there's one thing that unites humans, in fact, all life on Earth, it is the happiness we find when in good health.
Samira, I'm really excited to talk with our guest, Robert Cooper. He's a science fiction writer and television producer, and also a member of the rare genetic disease community. So he's in a position to both imagine how future genomic revolutions will impact people's lives, but also the very real-world applications of getting a gene therapy to solve a disease that he has right now today. So Robert works on the hit show Stargate SG1, and let's cut to a scene from that.
Chevron 7 is locked.
Good luck, SG1.
Just another everyday mission to save the galaxy, sir.
Indeed. Godspeed.
So that's Stargate. one of the greatest sci-fi shows ever made. And now we bring you Robert Cooper.
Well, it started with a movie that starred James Spader and Kurt Russell, and it was about a military expedition through a device that they had found, which was a big ring, and it opened a wormhole that took you to other planets. That sort of spawned a television series, which was created in 1997. We ended up going for 14 years and 17 seasons.
Oh, wow. So it's one of the longer running series out there, probably.
There are other shows that have surpassed us since then, but all told, it was somewhere around 360 hours of TV.
And what do you think it is about the Stargate concept that gives it such legs?
You know, the show is popular for a number of reasons. It takes place in the present day. It's stories about us dealing with advanced technology and aliens. Star Trek was set in an antiseptic future. It was sort of a aspirational vision of what maybe one version of what could be to come. And Stargate was kind of set in the messy present. It was kind of us muddling through and doing the best we could against this advanced technology.
The final attempt to solve our physiological degeneration has left each of us with a rapidly progressing disease.
It really wasn't an option for them. They made the choice to extend their life through science generations ago. Took any natural physiological evolution necessary for ascension out of the equation.
They're planning on ending their lives before the degeneration they're suffering from goes too far. Mass suicide.
They don't want any of their knowledge or technology falling into the wrong hands.
And they wanted us to witness the event.
So everything they've installed on this ship
is going to be their legacy.
Rob, so I was interested to know more about the young writer who got interested in science fiction.
I was always creative. I was always writing stories. It was always something I was very sort of inclined to do. I was born with a condition called hemophilia, which is a genetic disorder. As a child, I used to have to go down to the hospital to have cryoprecipitate, which is a clotting factor at the time that allowed your blood to clot. I think it hit my psyche on a level that was just way beyond anything I could handle at the time. I think I always felt like that caused me to have a greater awareness of wanting to maintain some control over your life. Writing and using your imagination gives you a control in a way that reality doesn't.
What is hemophilia? Just so we know what we're talking about.
Yeah, hemophilia is a genetic disorder in which you're missing one element of clotting factor protein that is in the blood that allows your blood to clot. And often you would have, hemophiliacs would have bleeds in their joints. So once you had had a damaging bleed in a joint, it would sort of become a recurring thing, and then you would develop arthritis. And
is there a gene therapy that you've mentioned that you're kind of waiting for?
I actually joined a study that was set up by one company that had a very sort of optimistic approach to gene therapy. And the truth of the matter is, it's just not working out as successfully as they hope. There's a lot of scientific complications to it. And what we're seeing in the few people who have been through the process is that it's not ready for prime time yet.
How many people worldwide are affected by this disease?
I don't know the exact number of worldwide. I know the stat is roughly 1 in 10,000 people have.
And is that common or uncommon for a rare genetic disease?
We think of ourselves as slightly on the rarer spectrum.
Yeah. So do you feel like you're part of a special community?
For sure.
What's the level of excitement in the community for gene therapy? Is it just optimistic across the board, or is there like an internal debate of this could be various other factors? What's the situation?
Well, the hemophilia community is dealing with the reverberations of a mass tragedy. At the very time that AIDS was emerging, a revolutionary new treatment for hemophilia was coming on board. They were freeze-dried concentrates, and essentially what they were was giant pools of blood that were then spun up into these very stable, essentially freeze-dried concentrates that you could reconstitute and inject. And I didn't go on an airplane until I was in my 20s. This was like, you could take a box with you, you could go anywhere, you could be free, essentially. The downside of it was that every box of concentrate you were taking, one injection was exposing you to 1,000 or 2,000 different people. It was a giant pool of blood. And it was happening at the same time AIDS was infecting the blood system. The community was just decimated. It was just a tragedy of epic proportions.
What percentage are we talking?
Like in the 70 to 80%.
So that must have been terrifying. 70 to 80% of your community is dying, essentially for these various reasons. It could be you at any time.
Yeah. There's nothing hemophiliacs could do when you need it. If you didn't take your treatment when you were bleeding, you could die. And so you had no choice, and yet the product you were taking was incredibly high risk of killing you as well. This was a very long answer to your question about how we approach new science. The community as a whole is very willing to adopt new ways of treatment, new science, but we're also very, very diligent and careful about it.
Samara, were you surprised at the reservations or caution that Robert expressed towards a potential gene therapy for hemophilia?
Well, I'm not surprised at all. I mean, so absolutely, that's a legitimate reservation they have.
For me, it was really important to get a sense of how much danger and fear that those afflicted with hemophilia just live with every day. I mean, the very clotting agent that they need to live, their lifeline, can also be deadly. And I was shocked when I heard that 70 to 80% of his community has died from a contaminated supply. That is really terrifying. It also speaks to the positive benefits the genomic revolution could bring. When you're curing and eliminating genetic disease like Robert's, this is an aspect of the genomic revolution that's going to be a great gift to humanity.
Yeah, and I think one of the advantages of gene therapies, most of the time, it eliminates the need for repeated treatments or repeated dosing. The challenges that exist include the price tag. Obviously, a lot of these are very expensive. So the questions of who gets access to these therapies is a very important and significant question and a challenge that needs to be solved.
In this podcast series, we've really explored how gene editing is a dual-use technology. So it's got all the positive applications, but then also there are ways that it can be used for harmful purposes. And dual use is a term that describes things like, we're all familiar with nuclear weapons versus, say, nuclear power. There's two uses there. But the difference with gene editing is that there really isn't any limiting technological factors. With nuclear weapons, for example, if you can control the uranium or the machinery, the centrifuges that they use to produce weapon-grade nuclear fuel, that's how different countries have slowed the spread of nuclear weapons. So gene editing is really different in that regard. There's not going to be a central authority that can kind of limit how it spreads. That means that whatever genetic technologies we develop, it's going to largely be a function of the culture that developed it. So the US government, for example, may have a very different idea of what they would fund, say, from what the Chinese government funds. Biohackers may have a very different take on human enhancement than, say, various Christian religions.
I mean, that's very interesting that you're talking about culture. Really, what is culture? In many ways, culture is defined by the stories we tell, the things we imagine to exist outside in the world. We talked about the fact that science fiction, drives the direction of the science and technology development.
Most of the stories that we tell are sort of dark and dystopian, and perhaps, therefore, that's the world we're going to create. Yeah, it's a brilliant idea, but it relies on the assumption that those two things are linked and that the stories we tell are actually creating the future. That's the assumption that has to be true. It could just be that science fiction writers are imagining the very near future because it's obvious what's coming next.
I kind of believe personally that they're very linked. The first thing we do with our, kids and babies is write bedtime stories for them, right? So imagination through stories is just deeply embedded in our essence of being human. And then we grow up and those babies and children grow up to become scientists and tech innovators. That is embedded in their subconscious and come back to the type of questions they're going to ask.
Well, let's put it to Robert, who is theoretically responsible for our future in this case. See what he thinks.
How much do you think that genetic conditions that you had contributed to you wanting to become a science fiction writer or a writer who puts his imagination of a future on a paper?
One of my favorite shows as a kid was The $6 Million Man.
We have the capability to make the world's first bionic man.
And I think that was probably because there was wish fulfillment there, for sure.
Better, stronger, faster.
He could do things I couldn't do. He could run faster, jump higher. He was strong, To me, it was always about how did it affect the character that was going through the situation? Like, it was, what was the story? I'm less concerned with the medicine and more who it's going to affect and whether it's going to make them, how it's going to make them feel. You look at a show like Black Mirror, which I really like a lot.
It's more like a waking nightmare.
And I think is intuitive about technology and where it's going and what. But to me, the most interesting part of Black Mirror is not just, there's going to be this science one day. It's this, what is this science going to do to us, to people?
Everything happens for a reason.
Let's talk about a movie like Gattaca for a moment. Where does that fall into the spectrum? And tell us a little bit about that story.
Gattaca is sort of a cautionary tale of genetics and our awareness of genetics.
I was conceived in the Riviera, not the French Riviera, the Detroit variety. They used to say that a child conceived in love has a greater chance of happiness. They don't say that anymore.
This guy wanted to go to space, and he was not allowed to because his genetics suggested that he was not a good enough human to survive space travel. And so he ends up buying someone else's genetics in order to get on the astronaut program.
And that's the way it was. Each day I would dispose of as much loose skin, fingernails, and hair as possible to limit how much of my invalid self I would leave in the valid world. At the same time, Eugene prepared samples of his own superior body matter so that I might pass for him.
It's certainly prescient in terms of where we're at, in terms of all of the genetics that are out there.
The basic premise of the technology is that the companies are able to sort the really intelligent, high-performing embryos from the not-so-great ones. And so you end up with two classes of people. There were the invalids and the valids.
You have this class system based on genetics that are essentially not that person's fault, not something within their control, and their choices about what they can and can't do to fulfill their life, to live their life, are being dictated to them. This is one vision of where this could go badly. People always respond, particularly in entertainment, to the negative more than the positive.
Is it because of the way people respond to negative dystopian stories, or is it much harder to write a story with a positive, rosy ending?
I have a theory. I just think that instinctively, our fight or flight instinct, our fear of death, is stronger than the need to seek pleasure. A car coming at you, or a guy with a knife behind you, or a meteor about to hit Earth, that is far more important to us than, a delicious sandwich.
In my field, I've seen many scientists who drive their inspiration from science fiction stories. In many ways, what we have seen in those movies, we kind of hacked in our imagination, and we want to build the world that we have seen in science fiction stories.
We all take inspiration from everything around us, right?
Has there been any moment in your writing career where you thought, oh, I don't think I want to go that way. I don't want to put this point in the story just because of a negative societal impact it might have?
You want to be honest. You want to reflect something. And sometimes that reality is bad. That would be a bad thing. And whether or not those creators feel somehow responsible is, it's a very personal. I can't possibly be responsible for what's going on in every human being's mind in the world. I think if you're doing it honestly and not trying to incite negative behavior, but rather show the downside of it, then I think that's perfectly acceptable artistically.
Do you feel like the future is sort of inevitable? Or how much agency do we have in choosing or shaping the future that we're all going to live in?
Look, I hate to be so fatalistic, but I mean, we are currently creating things that are going to get away from us. I just don't believe. I mean, the people who are out there going, we built it, we control it, we create the guardrails, and I just don't believe that. I just don't believe we have the ability, once the cat is out of the bag, to put it back.
And synthetic biology would fall into that category, I think.
Sure. The great cautionary tale that I do think science fiction repeatedly goes back to is we don't know what we don't know. We can't always control what we create. Even in situations where you had people with the best intentions, the right moral constitution, things go wrong. It's a problem that keeps me up at night.
The culture of science doesn't seem to really want to have any accountability for the technologies that they're creating. Can we modify this gene? Is that possible? It's these incremental little steps, more of a can we make it rather than a should we make it. And when you get to the point where, say, JK, who created the first enhanced babies, they made them immune to HIV, and he has spent very little time reflecting on the international outcry against the ethics of experimenting on babies.
Yeah, I mean, scientists are often, not unlike children trying to discover something cool and fun and new. And, I'm not putting myself above that in any way. That's what I do as a writer. And sometimes what you do is you figure out, oh my God, I can split an atom. Well, the initial euphoria of making that scientific discovery probably didn't immediately contain the foresight of an atom bomb. Science doesn't often take responsibility for the product of the discovery. Money is a big driver. If you're first with a new idea, it can be incredibly lucrative. Now you're going to get into politics of people saying, well, we don't want the government controlling us. But someone has to have the group mentality of maintaining a common good.
I think it's dangerous that this rapid pace of technological development is happening at the same time that we are losing faith in our institutions and our trust in government to regulate.
Well, let's face it, the technology is largely responsible for the lack of faith in the institution. And in some cases, it's justified, and in other cases, it's not.
So how is this going to play out? What do you think?
For the sake of my kids, and I want to believe that there's a hopeful version of the future, but the curve of technology and its advancements is way faster than we seem to want to or be able to adapt. Look, there's a proliferation of post-apocalyptic science fiction shows and movies and books because we see the potential for that as a reality and are looking for a way to somehow envision the survival of the human species in a way that makes life worth living. Like, that's what those stories are about. It's kind of scary.
Well, let's bring it back to synthetic biology or to gene therapy for a moment. your genetic situation could be potentially completely cured. It could change your life in a great way. And I hope that happens.
Thank you. And I would take it. I mean, look, I would totally take it. The answer is always about the individual, right? You're saying, well, I could be cured from that genetic discovery. Yes, but what's the world I'm going to live in? What opportunity am I going to have if the environment sucks or there's pandemics or world war, So I don't know that making people live longer is going to solve that.
Well, this has been wonderful talking with you, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. I'm frankly kind of a science geek, so this is thrilling for me.
I was really surprised by our conversation with Robert. I guess I expected him to be an optimist, but instead he was very sage in how he was able to touch upon so many different things that we've learned from all of our guests. Eerie in a way. He pointed out that as a culture, we are very fearful of what comes next, and that the writers are actually helping us envision how humanity might survive and carry on in those circumstances. Yet, at the very moment that we recognize that the pace of technological transformation is accelerating, our culture seems to be resisting the idea of regulation. Most surprising to me was that he was poised to give up a potential gene therapy that would hugely improve his own health and happiness if it meant that the larger genomic revolution itself would degrade the world that we all have to live in. And I thought that was very noble, actually. It also brings to light that it's very unlikely to get one without the other. The health benefits that we could see go hand in hand with the risks of bioterrorism and the hubris of science and all of that. They are the light and shadow of the very same thing. In this podcast, we heard from many people who are influential to how the genomic revolution will play out.
You think of how much revolution has occurred in the last 10 years in terms of reading and writing DNA. Imagine what we can do in the next 10 and the next 40.
The 21st century will be the century of biology.
So the question is this something that could be dangerous? Could it be misused?
We are currently creating things that are going to get away from us.
Now, whether it's next year, 10 years, 30 years, absolutely without question there will be a major event, whether it is accidental or intentional.
I think that's going to have to be accepted by the population, but that doesn't mean that you just sit idly by.
What if I could use the genome with enough data, with predictive analytics, to be able to give you precise information for precision health, to optimize your mind, your body, and your spirit, to reduce the cost of care, improve the quality and quantity of life? That's the power of the genome that I want to see used as well. And it is very much well worth the cost and well worth any risk to continue on this path of research.
We should have the expectation that the kinds of shadow problems that we've had to deal with tech will only be magnified by the significance of the fact that, our very flesh will be rendered in the image of these tech cultures.
Each point of view is shaped by their own unique experiences in life and the incentives of the positions that they hold. But ultimately, just like all of us, they're responsible to all of humanity. And as Joe Zahner says,
it's what makes us human that we tell stories. It's how we think in stories.
The story of humanity isn't just our history or our vision of the future or the technology we create. It is a chorus of competing aspirations. Each one of us has a small but vital voice in that choir.
So, how it all turns out is up to us.
Please support this podcast by sharing it and leave us a review. We'd also love to add your voice to this conversation. We will be hosting a live discussion around this topic, and you are invited to join. Check the show notes for details. The Make People Better podcast is brought to you by the Random Good Foundation. Thanks, and we'll talk with you again soon.